Welcome back. Last time we looked at the death scene of Jesus, his burial, and then moved to the empty tomb narrative with Peter, the beloved disciple, and Mary Magdalene. This led to the appearance of Jesus to the disciples while they were locked in the upper room, in which Jesus imparts the Johannine version of the commission familiar to us from the Gospel of Matthew, and in which Jesus discusses the faith of Thomas, who was not present for the first appearance. This is followed by a general conclusion that is written to the Gospel. In the current session, we will examine the epilogue, or the 21st chapter of the Gospel. This chapter has 5 parts: the fishing at Tiberias, the provision of Jesus of a meal on the shore for the disciples, the reconstitution of Peter, the fate of Peter and the beloved disciple, and finally, another conclusion. It is generally believed that the 21st chapter of John's Gospel was not part of the original Gospel text. It was added to the Gospel at a later date to answer a couple of questions that had arisen in the years after the Gospel began to circulate. The first concerned the position of Peter. As was clear in the discussion of the Gospel text, the beloved disciple is certainly the key person in the Gospel next to Jesus. However, as time marched on, it became clear to the Johannine Christians that they needed to ally with the greater church, or the churches under the other apostles, and most especially Peter, if they were going to survive. At this point, it became necessary to clarify the position of Peter vis-a-vis the beloved disciple. That clarification is found in the opening units of chapter 21. Second, the Johannine community believed that their leader, the beloved disciple, would remain living until the second coming, which was to be only a few years away. However, as time moved on again, it became clear that the second coming would not be that soon, and more than likely, the beloved disciple was going to succumb to death. That is what the remainder of chapter 21 deals with. The chapter begins simply with the connective "after this," metatauta, implying some time after the circulation of the gospel began. Then notes that another appearance of the risen Lord takes place, this time in Galilee, not Jerusalem, but rather along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, which is also known as the Sea of Tiberias. Since this narrative bears many similarities to the synoptic fishing episodes, especially the one found in Luke 5, many feel that what we have here is a combination of a pre-resurrection fishing tradition and a resurrection appearance narrative. A number of the disciples have returned to their fishing trade after the resurrection. Several are mentioned by name here: Simon Peter, Thomas, who we know is called the twin, Nathanael of Cana, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others. Simon Peter takes the initiative, announcing, "I'm going fishing," to which the rest respond that they will go with him also. So they embark in the boat and head out to the sea. It was evening. They fished all night, but they caught nothing. As the day was dawning, the use of the adverb proi serves to link this text with the opening of chapter 20 in the initial resurrection appearance to Mary Magdalene that we talked about last time. That text mentions that it was early, proi in Greek, when the women came to the tomb. Now we are told that Jesus appears and stands on the beach as the disciples are returning from their fishing expedition. The narrator adds that the disciples did not recognize Jesus. Most see this as an instance of Jesus in his resurrection state appearing in transcendent glory. There's something different about the resurrected body of Jesus. Nevertheless, Jesus questions whether they caught anything, to which they respond in the negative. So Jesus suggests they try again, only this time cast the net to the right side of the boat. There they will find some. Even though they do not recognize this man, they do what he suggests. The result was a catch so great that they could not haul it in. This leads the beloved disciple, of course, to recognize who this mysterious man was. He says to Peter, "It is the Lord." The reaction of Simon is immediate. He had minimal clothing on as he was working hard, so he makes himself more presentable and jumps into the water. Kustenberger, explains it in this way. Peter tucked his outer garment in order to be able to swim rather than wade. The shoreline drops off rapidly at most parts of the lake. We could swim ashore more easily, and then be properly dressed for greeting the Lord. Focus now turns to the other disciples. They come along rowing the boat and hauling the boat full of fish. All this occurred not too far from the land, only about 100 yards off. This sets up the next scene of the epilogue, the meal on the shore. The disciples get to land, and immediately they see a charcoal fire with some fish on it. Kostenberger notes that Jesus is ever the servant, and as such has prepared a fire and has already laid some fish on it to cook. But that was not enough to feed the whole group. So Jesus suggests that they bring some of the fish that they caught. Simon Peter springs into action, hauling the net ashore. Then we're given a rather peculiar fact. There were 153 fish. Many have tried to see a significance to that number of fish. Yet generally it's felt that the number does not have any particular meaning other than the fact that it represents evidence of God's favor. One final note, that despite the number, the nets remained intact. Then Jesus invites the disciples to come and have breakfast. Then the editor adds another note, a note that none of the disciples dare to ask, "Who are you?" As a result of the events they just witnessed, they knew it was the Lord. Then the meal is narrated. Jesus took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise with the fish. This is overtones of a scene earlier in the gospel gospel narrative, in the multiplication of loaves, that introduced the bread of life discourse in chapter 6. Beasley Murray notes, the Eucharistic significance of our present passage is shown by the similarity of chapter 21, verse 13, this verse, and chapter 6, verse 11 from the multiplication narrative, and by the contents of the meal, fish and bread, or a fish and a loaf. For only 2 meals are described in the fourth gospel, and they're both meals of bread and fish, with the former associated with the Eucharistic teaching in chapter 6. The narrative ends with a note that this was the third appearance of the risen Lord to the disciples. The first 2 appearances were narrated in chapter 20, verses 19 to 23 and 26 to 29. This verse also provides an inclusion with the opening verse of the chapter, where mention is made of the fact that Jesus revealed himself to his disciples. Thus, this narrative on the shores of the Sea of Galilee becomes an enclosing unit for the chapter. The next major scene takes place after they had eaten, introduced by the clause, when they had finished breakfast. It's a dialogue between Jesus and Peter. Many have seen this dialogue as the reconstitution of Peter after his triple denial during the Passion narrative. It is that and more. Jesus begins the dialogue with a question. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Interpreters have seen the meaning of this question in various ways. First, does Peter love Jesus more than he loves the other apostles? Second, he may be asking whether Peter loves him, Jesus, more than the tools of the fishing trade. And third, the possibility exists, does Peter love Jesus more than the other apostles love Jesus? This third seems, in the view of Kostenberger and others, to be the more likely interpretation of the question. Kostenberger says, those who want to be used significantly in God's service must be willing to make greater sacrifices for the Lord they serve. Then Peter's response, yes, Lord, you know that I love you, seems to affirm the love he has for Jesus, but not in comparison to anyone or anything else. Further, in Greek, the language in which the gospel was written, one notes a change of verbs here. Many will see no significance to it other than the fact that in several places, synonymous words are used to show stylistic variety. However, one could make a case for the two words for love that are used here. The first used by Jesus is agapao. It refers to God's love for us, God's unconditional love. In other words, Jesus asks, Peter, do you love me without any strings or conditions attached? Peter's answer utilizes another verb, phileo, which implies a more human conditional love. Thus, Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know that I love you with conditions. To this, Jesus commands Peter, feed my lambs. Perhaps as a result of that exchange, Jesus feels Peter is not where he should be, and therefore he asks the question again. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Utilizing the same verb, agapao, as the first question, thus, do you love me without conditions? To this, Peter gives the same answer as before, using the same verb. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you, with conditions. And Jesus then commands, tend my sheep. Again, the author varies vocabulary, sheep for lambs, tend for feed, etc. But again, Jesus has not received the answer that he would like, and so he asks the question a third time. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Note, this time Jesus uses the same word as Peter, implying that now Peter does love Jesus with conditions. The editor adds a short note, that Peter was grieved, sad, or sorrowful that Jesus had asked this same question a third time. But then Peter answers, you know everything, Lord, you know that I love you, with conditions. Curiously, the author chooses the two different words for know also in Peter's response. Jesus then reiterates his first command, feed my sheep. Many will object to putting any special weight on the two Greek words for love, since the original dialogue between Peter and Jesus took place in Aramaic, not Greek, and in Aramaic there is no such distinction. However, the inspired text that we have is in Greek, and the nuances of love are contained in the words used in that inspired text. Jesus asks unconditional love of Peter, which at this point Peter is unable to give. Yet Jesus does not treat Peter with any less love because of it. Instead, he tells Peter that the day will come when Peter will unconditionally love him, as the text continues. Truly I say to you, Jesus continues, contrasting the younger Peter with the older Peter. He says, when you were young, you girded yourself and walked where you would. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish to go. Many see this as an application of a proverb popular in the time, contrasting the vigor of youth with the frailty of old age. Maloney, on the other hand, sees it as linking Peter's youth with his relationship to Jesus prior to the death and resurrection, full of vigor and self-confidence. And when you are old, with his subsequent experience, that will be the fruit of his unconditional love for Jesus. So using the multiple verbs for love, the author wishes to say Peter may love Jesus conditionally now, but the day will come when he will love him totally, completely, and without conditions. That seems to be confirmed by the further editorial comment, this he said to show by what death Peter was to glorify God. The reference is to the fact that by the time that this section of the gospel was written, it's clear that the redactor knows that Peter has died, and he has died a martyr's death. The dialogue concerning Peter ends with a further command of Jesus, follow me. This is an invitation to Peter to eventually follow Jesus in giving his life. Kostenberger notes that the rest of Peter's life must be lived in the shadow of the cross, just as Jesus' life was. Here is a picture of the church commemorating the event we have just narrated. It's located along the shores of the Sea of Galilee and is known as the Church of Peter's Primacy. Inside the church, in the sanctuary, there is a large stone known as the Mensa Christi, or the Table of Christ, which is commemorative of the spot where Jesus fed the disciples with the fish, hence his table. Outside the church, there are a series of sculptures and altars. Here is a sculpture depicting the dialogue between Peter and Jesus. It has the inscription, "Feed my sheep," in both English and German below it. And finally, to commemorate the visit of Pope St. John Paul to the church, one of the altars is adorned by a mosaic of Pope St. John Paul, pictured here. Now the focus shifts to the beloved disciple. Peter turns and sees the beloved disciple following him. The editor adds a few details to show that it is the one who had been introduced earlier as the beloved disciple that's being referred to here. First, it's mentioned that this disciple had lain close to the breast of Jesus during the Last Supper. This recalls John 13:23. Second, at the behest of Peter, it was this disciple that asked Jesus the identity of the betrayer in John 13:25. When Peter sees the beloved disciple, he plainly asks Jesus, "Lord, what about this man?" If Peter is to die a martyr's death, what's the fate of the beloved disciple? Jesus basically answers Peter's question obliquely, letting him know that it's none of his business. Jesus says, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what's that to you?" This strange statement makes sense, in the thought of Flanagan and his commentary on the gospel, where he says, only if a belief that the beloved disciple would live to see Jesus' final coming had been shattered by his unexpected death would this make sense. Thus, Peter is not to worry about the fate of the beloved disciple. He's to get about the work that Jesus called him to do, that is, to follow him. And this following will take the particular form of assuming the leadership role in the community when Jesus ascends to the Father. The editor now enters with an explanation, since the saying had spread among the brethren that the beloved disciple would not die. However, through the use of the Greek particle de, the author now clarifies, a clarification that would be made necessary only upon the death of the beloved disciple. The clarification is to look at Jesus' words a second time. The editor notes that Jesus did not say that the beloved disciple was not going to die. Rather, he said in the form of a conditional sentence, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what's that to you? This condition does not express factuality. Rather, it expresses a supposition. Thus, the saying of the brethren was false. Now, this same disciple, in the final sentences of the gospel, is identified as the source of the whole gospel. The disciple who is bearing witness to these things, he's called, and further, as the author of the gospel who has written these things. This is followed by an affirmation of the truth of the things witnessed and written. We know that his testimony is true. That we is the first readers of the gospel, but also in many ways the we of verse 24 involves generations of Christian readers who know that this witness is true and who can give witness to their own belief that the truth sets people free. Then the final conclusion, the final words of the gospel appear. These final verses reiterate the thought that was set forth in John 20:30-31 in a somewhat brusque manner. The author says, but there are many other things which Jesus did, implying that this is not a complete biography of Jesus. Continuing, he says, were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Anyone who reads or hears this gospel must not suspect that the story just read exhausts all that could be said about Jesus. What is significant is that this book reveals the love of the Father manifest through Jesus Christ, calling all who encounter that revelation to a decision of faith in God, a decision that leads ultimately to salvation. The challenge that has been given to many of the characters of the gospel is now the challenge given to us, to you who have just finished this gospel. The answer, the question that really comes up is, what will your decision be? Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this study of the Gospel of John. Keep checking this site as we shall be beginning a similar study of the Acts of the Apostles in the next few weeks. See you then.